Everybody, we're going to get started with the first technical session of the day, and our first speaker is Derek Paley.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to give a, thank you. Almost sarcastic, but no, I know it wasn't. I'm just kidding. I'm going to give a little bit of a different talk today. So I wear a few different hats at the university, you know, I've been the director of the Robotics Center since 2019. I direct our engagement with the Army Research Lab, where I spend a lot of time working on aerial autonomy and increasingly ground autonomy, including some of our partnerships with Amazon, et cetera. But actually, my background before I joined the University of Maryland was in underwater robotics. And I've been maintaining a line of funding from the Office of Naval Research in this area for many years now. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about our work in underwater, in the underwater domain, particularly looking at multi-vehicle control. So this topic is near and dear to my heart. This is a photo from over 22 years ago. I was a software engineer for a company, MIT startup called Bluefin Robotics. And this is me working on a deep sea submersible, an unmanned underwater vehicle that we manufactured for Thales Geosolutions. And this really ignited my passion for autonomy. In fact, the undersea domain, I would argue, is really what gave birth to autonomy, because unlike in the air and ground domains, there's no possibility for remote operation without a tether. And that's primarily due to the fact that electromagnetic signals attenuate really rapidly in seawater. And so the vehicle, once launched, has to have the capabilities on board to navigate and to perceive its environment and to conduct a mission autonomously. So the Office of Naval Research had a vision in the late 1990s of an autonomous ocean sampling network. And that funding really triggered a lot of advancements in this domain. Due to the challenges of operating in the undersea environment, the natural tendency for engineers is to look at how biology solves this problem. And so we have, for many years, been looking at fish, their ability to perceive the environment, to perceive each other. And this is a snippet from a program called Blue Ocean. And so, indeed, their schooling behavior has especially fascinated me. And that is the subject of a current line of funding from the Office of Naval Research, looking at the hydrodynamic efficiencies that emerge from this kind of behavior. So the question remains, how do fish exhibit this behavior, and how did the complex patterns that you see here on the screen emerge from simple interactions? Let me go back a few years. So we built a multi-fish tracking framework shortly after arriving here at the University of Maryland in 2007. I hired an aerospace engineering student and convinced him that fish are cool. And he helped me develop a system to reconstruct the 3D movement, indeed the 3D shape of individual fish in a school, as an initial attempt to try to understand their movements and their behaviors. And in particular, we studied this phenomenon that you saw there on the right, known as a fast start, which is their response to predators. And so then we started to think a little bit about how to reverse engineer, in particular, the hydrodynamic sense in fish, which is embodied in their so-called lateral line system. And we implemented a series of feedback controllers that utilized an architecture similar to our lateral line, namely a distributed array of pressure sensors. And so this foil is a soft rubber foil that's being operated in a flowing water tank. The tank is, the water is flowing from left to right, and you may be able to make out a few small holes in the side of the foil in which we've embedded pressure sensors. And using spatially distributed pressure sensing around the perimeter of the fish, even without the visual sense, allows us to perform certain fish-like behaviors, such as station holding. And so this robot was actually able to maintain its position in the tank despite being suspended from a set of frictionless air bearings that would otherwise allow the drag force to push it downstream. And so this was the first instance of a bio-inspired feedback controller for an underwater robot. Then we got a little bit more advanced, and we sought to replicate a behavior that fish exhibit known as Kármán gating. And so Kármán gating occurs either in the wake of an obstacle, an upstream obstacle, or in the wake of another fish. And it's a tendency that fish have to actually slalom around the series of oncoming vortices. So here we built a system, and now the air bearings, rather than being aligned with the streamwise direction, are in the cross-stream direction. And the fish to the right is exhibiting the Kármán gating behavior utilizing 4 pressure sensors that it uses to reconstruct the vortex street, as it's called, that's being generated by the flapper on the left. And it's controlling its angle of attack relative to the flow, which generates a lift force. In this case, the lift is generated perpendicular to the flow direction, so it's able to move back and forth on those air bearings and exhibit this slaloming behavior. And we had an interesting finding in this work, which was that, in fact, to observe or estimate and reconstruct the vortex street, the ideal trajectory to maximize the information you collect is actually to collide with the vortices. But for energy efficiencies, fish actually slalom around them. And so there's an interesting trade-off between energy and information acquisition. So next we actually started to build some free swimming fish. So these fish are untethered, and they have an internal reaction wheel, which is basically a motor with a heavy metal disc attached to it. It's a technology used in aerospace engineering, particularly in satellites. And by rotating that heavy metal disc back and forth, we can generate flapping behavior. So the body of the fish is made of rubber, and it has an internal pressure vessel which contains the motor and the other electronics. And indeed, what they're doing is they're communicating with one another in order to align their swimming direction, a process that we think of as synchronization. And they're able to do that by using feedback control. So then we deployed these fish in our neutral buoyancy research facility. So for those not aware, we have the largest underwater research facility on a university campus, and it's 25 feet deep. Here you see it, especially nice blue color, and our school of robotic fish are swimming on the surface or near the surface, exhibiting that synchronization behavior. And this was a really nice result. In fact, the student who did this graduated on Monday with his PhD in aerospace engineering, Anthony Thompson, and I'm very proud of it. However, this interaction is based on communication and not sensing, which is to say that the fish have radios on board, and the reason that they're operating near the surface is because those radios don't work underwater, and they're broadcasting their swimming direction, and then performing the closed-loop control that allows them to synchronize their headings. But it's not very bio-inspired because fish don't communicate in that manner. Instead, they passively perceive their environment and their neighbors using sensing, whether it's pressure-based sensing or visual sensing. So that motivated our next and ongoing research. I will also highlight some work that we did on intermittent swimming, because unlike our robotic fish, real fish don't flap their tails continuously. They exhibit a behavior that we think of as burst and coast. And this presented an interesting opportunity for us to decouple what are 2 functions of an engineered system that are typically operated concurrently, which is actuation and sensing. But by decoupling them, we could explore the hypothesis that the burst phase, that is to say when they flap their tails, that is when the actuation is being performed. And the coast phase, which is when they just glide forward, is when the sensing or perception is being performed. And there's some evidence for this because the lateral line system in fish, remember that's the system that perceives the hydrodynamic environment, that actually gets masked in their neural system when they flap their tails because of the self-noise that's generated. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our present and ongoing work, and I'll highlight the contributions of some students and postdocs shown on the right there. So I'm going to start with talking about predator-prey interactions, and this is a collaboration with some colleagues at the University of California, Irvine, a biologist, Matt McHenry, who we've worked with for a number of years. Then I'll talk a little bit about neighbor estimation during schooling. So how might we engineer a capability similar to what fish exhibit in terms of estimating where their neighbors are and responding to those positions. Now I'll talk a little bit about some work on feedback stabilization of vortex position. So the idea there is to use deformations of the body of a soft robotic fish in order to improve hydrodynamic efficiency in close proximity swimming. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about some experimental work that we've just gotten underway. So regarding the predator-prey interaction, so our collaborator Matt McHenry and his student Ashley have been working with the species, an invasive species known as the lionfish. And you can see the lionfish there on the right, and then there's a little dot that it's chasing around, which is the prey fish. Lionfish are voracious eaters, and part of the reason that they are a problem in the coastal waters of the US is because they pretty much eat everything. And so there's increased urgency to understand lionfish and its predation techniques. And one of the key characteristics you see of the lionfish is that it has these rather bulky pectoral fins that it uses to herd the prey, especially in a bounded environment. And so as aerospace engineers, we thought, well, that's really interesting because by extending those pectoral fins, it creates much more drag. And it seems to us that there's a trade-off between drag and the ability to capture the prey. And so we decided to build a model to explore this. And so we started by basically representing the pursuer as a streamlined rigid body with these pectoral fins that can either be in the streamlined or back configuration or the forward configuration. And really the only difference there would be the drag coefficient. But the evader is modeled as having this intermittent swimming capability. And when it bursts, it can actually swim faster than the lionfish, but it doesn't sustain that. It slows down due to drag, and it exhibits what's called in biology a protean strategy, which is basically a biased random walk. But the direction that it chooses to flee is random, and it depends on the proximity of the boundary, and it depends on the prey's ability to perceive the lionfish. So if the lionfish has its fins spread wide, then the prey avoids the entire tip-to-tip direction or silhouette of the lionfish. And so in that way, the prey can, the escape directions that the prey can take are influenced by the shape of the predator. So here are some results that Anthony derived having to do with the transition that occurs between the optimal configuration being the fins retracted versus the fins expanded. And that transition occurs when the expected work to capture the prey becomes less for the fins in the out configuration. You can see that plot on the left where the expected work for retracted is less until it reaches a crossing point. And on the right, you can see that occurs when the predator gets a little bit closer to the prey, then it switches to the fins out. And the expected work calculation I'm not showing here because it's rather involved, but it takes into account that the prey fish is exhibiting a stochastic behavior, and therefore we have to use probability theory to calculate the expected work. So we can actually do this analysis over the entire domain, and indeed, in a domain that's not bounded, it's actually optimal for the predator to keep the fins back. But it's only in this bounded domain, like you would find in like a coral reef, where there's other structures, that's advantageous for the predator to sweep the wings forward or the fins forward. And you can see these orange silhouettes represent the switching boundary. So anywhere inside those orange regions, it's better to have your fins out, and outside, it's better to have the fins back. And so we can look at optimal strategies for pursuit under these assumptions. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some work by a former MRC postdoc. So Artur Walk's now on the faculty at UNC Charlotte. And so Artur has been looking at this question of how do we assimilate information from a spatially distributed array of pressure sensors, in particular to reconstruct the relative position and velocity of our neighbor fish. And so the assumptions that went into this are that we have an array of sensors shown as these white squares, and each one of those measures a scalar value over time, and those scalar values are shown on the right. In fact, the measurement that we use is the difference, pairwise differences between the absolute pressure measured by each of these sensors, and that way we're independent of the depth of the fish below the surface, and we're independent of any drift that the pressure sensors might exhibit as a function of temperature. So looking at pressure differences, we see that these signals fluctuate depending on the proximity to our neighbors. And so indeed, by invoking a hydrodynamic model known as a dipole model for each of these swimming fish, then their motion influences the pressure signal that its neighbors receive, and we can use those fluctuations to reconstruct the position and velocity of each fish in the school. And so here's the architecture, and you see that we invoke a particle filter. Is this microphone sort of dropping out periodically, or is that just my ears? Okay, all right. We invoke a Bayesian filter known as a particle filter to reconstruct the states of our neighbors, in particular their orientation relative to us, because that's what we use in our synchronization law that I mentioned a few slides ago, which allows us to steer to align with our neighbors. And so we can use this architecture in what's called an output feedback control, where we're using the output of our sensors to update the estimate, which is used in the control law, and then you iterate. And so here are some results that were submitted to IROS recently. And you can see the two fish results. So interpreting, here's the particle filter, and you can see how it rapidly converges to the estimate. And the estimation is done in the frame of reference of the focal fish rather than the inertial frame, because that's the reference frame in which each fish perceives the environment. So you can see the particle filter works quite well in the two fish case, and as well in the three fish case, although it does become a little bit computationally burdensome because of the number of particles that you need to use. And so, this is ongoing work to look at how to make this efficient enough to implement on board. So next I'll talk a little bit about hydrodynamic efficiency, which is the theme of the current ONR funding, namely this question of feedback stabilization of vortex position. And this is work done by Rose Gebhardt, who's an aerospace PhD student here, and she's supported by our grant, and we'll be spending the summer at the Naval Undersea Warfare Center in Rhode Island. So a previous student of mine looked at this question by thinking about it in the complex plane as follows. So if you look at the animation on the left, basically what you see is a disk exhibiting this surging and heaving motion. And the reason we started with a disk is because there's a transformation of complex variables known as a conformal mapping that allows you to take a disk and map it to a foil shape. And indeed, it's that heaving motion of the disk that corresponds to deformation of the foil. So it's a really natural mathematical environment to study fish behavior and the fluid motion near the fish. And for that, we invoke a tool known as potential flow. And so in a potential flow model, it's a very low dimensional representation of the fluid, and it allows us to write it down in state space form. And so for any of you who've taken my class, we know that the state space representation is the starting point for the feedback control design. And so what my former student Daniel showed is that in the disk plane on the left, he could actually stabilize the position of a vortex near the disk, which you can see both in the inertial frame here and then in the frame of reference of the disk. You see this nice stable spiral, which is indeed, in the open loop case, an unstable equilibrium point. The vortex would not naturally stay there but for the motion of the disk. And so the question that Rose has been addressing is how to extend those results to the foil plane. And so Rose has explored this, and you can see indeed how there are actually 4 equilibrium points that this vortex could reach, and those equilibrium points depend on the shape of the fish. And you can see those red and blue lines are what are known as Nulk lines, and it's how we determine the equilibrium points, because both the horizontal motion of the vortex and its up-down motion would have to be 0 for it to be an equilibrium point. But just because a point is an equilibrium point, it doesn't mean that it's stable. And so indeed, these are generally unstable equilibrium points unless we flap the fish by deforming its shape. And so Rose has showed that by deforming its shape, we can stabilize a set of fixed points. Sorry, I misspoke. We can stabilize a set of initial conditions shown in blue there. And so these are closed loop results, which I'll attempt to loop here. And the blue shows the set of initial conditions for which we can stabilize the fixed point, shown as that white X. And so these are the animation shows one particular initial condition. But as a matter of fact, if we start anywhere in that blue region, then we can capture a vortex and drive it to a given fixed point by deforming the shape of the fish body. But the question is, why would we want to do that? And the truth is, we don't. But it's a starting point for the problem that we actually want to solve, which is tracking a particular trajectory. Because what we know is that the forces on the fish depend on the trajectory of vortices as they pass the fish in the fluid. And if we can steer a vortex to a trajectory that conveys advantage to the swimming behavior of the fish, then we've improved the hydrodynamic efficiency. So the stabilization problem is sort of a canonical problem in control theory. And if you can solve the stabilization problem, then you can go on and solve the trajectory tracking problem. So that's the problem that we study next. And we formulated the trajectory tracking problem by imagining that the fish is swimming, and therefore its body shape is changing sinusoidally. And what the control input shows up as a perturbation of the phase of that open loop signal. So if we had no control, where phi is the phase variable, then phi would be constant, and the fish would just flap, and it wouldn't change its flapping behavior at all as the vortex passes it by, and you sort of get what you get. But by assigning the control input u to the rate of change of this phase variable, then we can adjust our flapping behavior ever so slightly in order to steer the vortex. And so that's what's shown in this animation, which shows 3 things to draw your attention to. First is the gray silhouette is the open loop fish shape. And you can see the black silhouette, the closed loop fish shape, is very similar. We're only perturbing the swimming behavior ever so slightly, which may be why we don't necessarily observe this in fish, because it doesn't take much to do this. Then by looking at those 3 colored lines, you can see that we're driving the purple vortex from its default trajectory, which is the red curve, to the desired trajectory, which is the blue curve. And that adjustment, if the blue curve, the desired trajectory, is chosen based on optimization, let's say, of the hydrodynamic efficiency, what we've shown is a strategy that can maximize that performance. And so in ongoing work, we're looking at which trajectory we would like to actually stabilize. And you can imagine that this is in the context of inline swimming behavior with an upstream fish. All right, so lastly, I'll talk a little bit about our experimental work that's being supported by Wei-Kuo Yen, who's a postdoc that is co-sponsored by the Maryland Robotics Center and the Matrix Lab. Matrix Lab, as some of you may know, is our new facility in Southern Maryland that's housed in the USMSM Smart Building. And Wei-Kuo was assisted by Kruti Bingradia, who is an undergraduate student in aerospace engineering. So the basic philosophy here, as I've kind of alluded to throughout the talk, is that we seek to combine two sensing modalities in a feedback control loop that can maximize the hydrodynamic efficiency of swimming in close proximity to another fish. And that's kind of a mouthful, but one of the leading hypotheses for this inline swimming behavior is that the follower fish should synchronize its tail beat frequency with the lead fish, but offset the phase of that flapping behavior in proportion to the downstream distance. And that the intuition behind that comes from the fact that vortices, of course, are being advected from left to right due to the oncoming flow, and those vortices reach the follower fish a little bit after they're produced by the upstream fish. And so in a manner of thinking, this is a synchronization phenomenon whereby you would like the downstream fish to flap its tail just at the right time when that vortex arrives. That's what's called in the literature as vortex phase matching. And we believe that we can produce vortex phase matching using feedback control. And so this control architecture shows a combination of pressure sensing to estimate the flow speed and angle of attack, and visual sensing in order to determine how far away the lead fish is. And so we are in the process setting up this experiment. Here is the smart building, and there on the right is the hydrology lab. So this is a large water tunnel that was opened just last October, and it has a 80 centimeter by 130 centimeter cross section that's about 2 meters long, so plenty of room for us to put some fish in there. And so Wakewo has been working on that. And so this is kind of a busy slide, but let's start on the right, because that's probably where your eyes are going right now. And so that is actually a benchtop demonstration using our reaction wheel driven free swimming robots. We open them up, and turns out they work really well if you just put a little piece of paper under them, because then there's no friction on the table. And what they're doing actually is they're using onboard cameras. Well, the redfish is using an onboard camera to regulate its flapping phase relative to the bluefish in front, based on the leader's flapping frequency and phase. Now we're cheating a little bit because we solved this computer vision problem using LEDs, and so you can see there's an LED that flashes every time the lead fish flaps its tail. So we're using LEDs here as a proxy for perceiving the actual motion of the lead fish. But nonetheless, that's an illustration of vortex phase matching. What the video doesn't show is that if you move the redfish further away, it changes its phase offset. All right, so moving from right to left here, in the middle, what you see these are some preliminary experimental results from the water tank, showing that we can estimate U, which is the flow speed, and alpha, which is the angle of attack, for the fish that's shown on the left. So now if I can draw your attention to the leftmost fish, this is our new fish, suspended once again on air bearings that are aligned with the flow in this case, and that fish is equipped with 5 pressure sensors that it can use to perceive the flow. And so here's an illustration of a short video of the fish swimming together. The lead fish is not on the air bearings, and the follower fish is on the air bearings, and so the follower fish is going to use onboard pressure and visual sensing in order to maximize its hydrodynamic efficiency of swimming in the wake of the lead fish. So I will wrap up with just a summary of some of our other related modeling work. Happy to chat more about this offline. But so each row of this table shows a different approach to modeling. I've told you about some of them, but not all of them. The top row is kind of an interesting hypothesis that we have to study inline swimming using a special form of conformal mapping that preserves periodic boundary conditions in the flow. So in that top left image, there are these light blue vertical lines, and those represent periodic boundaries. So in fact, even though you see 3 fish in that image, there's only 1 fish because it's on a cylinder. So it's kind of like having a fish in a circulating water channel. Anything that comes out, that comes in from the left goes out the right, and so that's why that produces this symmetry. And so the idea, which has a little bit of traction, is that we can study a whole school of fish by just looking at one fish, which kind of simplifies the model. Then I told you already about the deformable foil and the potential flow mapping in the second row. The third row is kind of interesting. So this is work looking at the fluid structure interactions, because of course just like our robotic fish, real fish have deformable bodies. And so the way that we model a deformable body, especially one in a fluid, is that we study its shape. And indeed, in this case, the shape is dominated by its bending. In general, when we model an elastic structure, such as a rod, there are sort of three general shape deformations. There's bending, there's stretching, and there's twisting. But stretching and twisting don't really matter too much to us in this setting. It's really just the bending. And what we know about deformable structures is that the potential energy, when you bend a deformable structure away from its intrinsic shape, it generates potential energy, just like a spring. And then it wants to restore to that shape. And so the way that we imagine using this modeling tool is that the control input will come in as the change, or perhaps rate of change, of the intrinsic shape. And then we'll study how the closed loop system behaves under the influences of the forces. And then lastly, at the bottom there, that's just a little cartoon where we actually have made some nice insights about this inline swimming behavior from very, very simple reduced order models that looks at basically the thrust, drag, balance on the trailing fish and how that's affected by the phase of its flapping motion. So with that, I will stop, and I thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks, Derek. So our next speaker is Yadis Alamonius. Yadis, do you want to get your computer set up? We have time for maybe one question for Derek Paley.
Really great talk, Dr. Perry. It was quite insightful to see bio-inspired robots. I just had one question when you presented Anthony's work with the bounded lionfish, right? So I was just thinking, if it's not bounded, how will the behavior and analysis change?
So the model works in the unbounded setting, and what it predicts is that it's actually better to keep your fins back.
Okay.
Because there's nothing really to herd the fish
Mm-hmm.
into. It's only when you sort of trap the prey fish against the boundary and further reduce its escape directions by spreading your fins that the slow predator can capture the fast prey.
Okay.
The other thing I didn't tell you, though, is that lionfish use a form of feeding known as suction feeding. So once the prey gets close enough, they actually can sort of inhale it. And so that helps it too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You mentioned that either we're actually either using You mentioned the fish were either actually using vision or pressure. Are they using both, or okay?
Yes. So what we know about fish is that they do use multimodal sensing, and so one of the things that my collaborator does is he does sensory deprivation experiments. So for example, you can actually annihilate the lateral line in fish using an antibiotic, because the lateral line sensors are actually tiny little hair cells, which are fast growing, and when you treat the fish with a certain antibiotic, it kills the fast growing cells. So you can temporarily disable the lateral line, and likewise you can also turn the lights out. And so by doing sensory deprivation experiments, they can kind of tease out the role of these different sensing modalities. But the interesting thing about fish is I think of it as sort of like a waterbed. When you push down on one side of a waterbed, you're old enough to remember what a waterbed is. When you push down on one side of it, the other side comes up. Fish tend to do that. So you suppress one sensing modality, they kind of make up for it with the other one. They're really flexible in that regard, so it's very interesting.